Dr. Michael Cotton, and this presentation is titled Unitary Evolutionary Spirituality and an Emerging New Religion. I'm the creator of Source Code Meditation and the 9 Summits of Transformation, which are integrally informed technologies that first emphasize the physiology of change and higher consciousness. I established the New Human University and I co-founded the nonprofit, the New Human Research and Development Institute. The New Human University is a community of people exploring what we call Epoch 6, which is the next stage of development beyond post-modernity. It's also called integral and super integral and metamodern and second and third tier, etc. And there is some corollary to all of these terms within all of these terms, but we have our own somewhat unique understanding. And in fact, we just this week submitted a 128-page article to the Integral Review, which is the transdisciplinary and transcultural journal for New Thought, Research, and Practice. And the article is titled Catalyzing and Measuring the New Human, the New Human University, Homeostatic Hierarchical Integration and Developmental Electroencephalography. My team and I have been measuring both subjective spiritual states, developmental structure stages, and their objective brain correlates so that we can not only understand these correlates, but use the research to further promote our teachings, technologies, and practices to catalyze higher state and higher stage development. So I say all of this to provide context going forward as to why I believe a new religion based on a new spirituality and a new spiritual experience is needed. And I realize that this idea of a new religion is not really in vogue with many of us in the late stage modern world. I realize that there is a lot of polarity produced by the word religion. But what I also know is where there's polarity, there's energy, and energy can be used for transformation. So many of the modern and postmodern academics, scientists, etc., are atheist. Many of the postmodern, the New Age group, and the New Thought crowd are spiritual but not religious. And the thing that they both share, the thing in common, is that they reject the idea of religion. A misplaced rejection that I believe is largely due to their conflation of religion with mythic literal religion, considering all religion to be the same as mythic literal religion. That version of religion believed in by the traditional stage of development that preceded modernity is what we would call mythic literal religion. But I don't think it should be considered religion in general. So an understanding of the evolution of consciousness and developmental theory creates great clarity around this issue. Ethnocentric believers in a religion relate to that religion through the filter of their stage of development. Modernist believers in the same religion will relate to that religion through their filter. Postmodern believers in that same religion will relate to that religion through their filter, and so on. They will all believe in different things and behave in different ways, even though they may subscribe to the same quote-unquote religion. So religion isn't really the problem. Underdeveloped believers in religions are the problem. Violent believers in religions are the problem. Not so much the religion, and certainly not religion per its general definition. So here's a question I ask around this polarity that is produced by religion, or this rejection, this outright rejection of religion by modernist and postmodernist, and even now what I would say metamodernist thinkers. The question I ask, and I mean it sincerely, is to just consider what your definition of religion actually is. Before you attack the word, figure out what the definition of the word is. Define religion so you can understand what it is you don't like. To be clear, I'm not asking for a description of the corruption within a religion. Not any more than if I were asking you to define the word government, I would be asking you to define corruption within a government. In other words, governments often become corrupt. But the definition of government is not equal to corruption. To continue this reasoning just a little longer, government has a definition, and most governments end up corrupt. Does that mean the world does not need government? Should we promote anarchy because historically so many governments have ended up corrupt? Do you believe this? Or do you believe, like I believe, what we really need is a better government and better people running the government? And so if you believe this, that government isn't the problem by definition, but that the corruption within most governments is the problem, then we really need a better government, not no government, or the absence of all governments. And if this reasoning rings true, then why don't we also believe that we really need a better religion and more developed people in the religion as opposed to no religion? Because spiritual but not religious movements aren't working for most. The anything goes nature and lack of potent practices has turned most of them into postmodern flatland communities, no longer concerned with the pursuit of genuine enlightenment and certainly not promoting the vertical, keyword vertical evolution of one's consciousness. We have mistaken the level of consciousness of the believer and whatever violence or corruption that creeps in to the religion. But the two don't really have that much to do with each other. Humans will always search for meaning. They'll always organize around what's of ultimate importance. They will always benefit from practices, paths, and communities that are aligned with their highest aspiration. And that makes a religion. They will always have spiritual experiences. They will always try to make sense of those experiences, and good maps help. And a new religion can provide good maps. So I don't believe we need more spiritual but not religious. That's the anarchy to religion. It's the resistance without a real solution. And in many cases, if not most cases, it's not working. It's certainly not working for millions and millions of people that identify in that group. The group that identifies as spiritual but not religious is statistically one of the most confused, disoriented, foreboding, and meaning-deprived groups in Western culture. Spiritual but not religious. Its entropy is increasing, and it's time to reorganize before its disorder just goes into complete chaos. So again, just to be clear, I'm not calling for more ethnocentric religion. I'm calling for a radical new religion based on a radical new awakening and a radical new way to be in the world that I call the unitary evolutionary enlightenment of a unitary evolutionary spirituality. And it has teachings, practices, and community, and therefore it's a religion. Now, I would like to make a point about this, what I call emergent new religion, that I think is very important. A new religion needs a fire starter. A new religion that has a new spirituality needs a fire starter. It needs a way to disrupt the ossified patterns of human apathy, procrastination, and despair, and to awaken dormant potential within the physiology and even within the subtle energy system of the human body. This fire starter is what we have been cultivating through our work. And it's what I call the activation of an inner organic technology, a dormant process inside of you, an emergent potential that can actually mobilize subtle energy in the body and awaken higher potential within the physical brain. We actually measure this at our institute. I believe so much of even the sophisticated teachings of the esoteric paths of the world's wisdom traditions are somewhat impotent now, with so many of them having only written or oral teachings and or meditative or contemplative practices, but not being integrally informed. There's an emphasis on the upper left or interiority. Take meditation, for instance. The upper right, from an integral perspective of the energy, physiology, brain, the upper right components are often missing or lag way behind in amplitude and sophistication. And what's interesting to note is that the energy elements, these upper right elements of awakening, were at one time crucial to the most sophisticated spiritual systems of antiquity, whether it's the Shaivite Tantrikas or the Vajrayanas. This latent, subtle energy was paramount. It was even a significant part of the genius sage Sri Aurobindo's approach to spiritual growth. And although these ancient realizers did have an idea as to the importance of energy, they knew almost nothing about the impact of the brain, the actual physical brain, on awakening states, on states of consciousness. And we now know that there are dormant higher brain capacities that must be awakened in humanity. And I now know that a latent energy of the body can become the higher brain's potential energy source. And energy within us can actually be mobilized in a way that it awakens higher potential in the human brain. Higher potential that is an association. Its correlates are higher consciousness and awakening states. So the slumbering energy that I've been referring to in one form or another, in a lot of different forms, has been known for thousands of years. Referred to by many names, from Kundalini, and the listeners of this will all be familiar with this term, Kundalini or prana, of the ancient yogis of India, to Qi and Qi by the Taoist healers and acupuncture practitioners of China. It was called serpent energy to ancient Egyptians, and some scholars have even believed this secret energy is the Holy Ghost referenced in Christian traditions. But by whatever name, this internal energy has been utilized in a host of different healing arts and personal and spiritual transformation systems the world over. Nearly all of the disciplines and practices that acknowledge this latent energy knew that it was associated with certain pathways or flows in the body. As with the energy itself, many names have been given, and many models of the organization of these pathways have been considered throughout history. A variety of different healing techniques and wisdom traditions have all had their own unique approaches and understanding to these pathways and the energy flows that were associated with them. Whether referred to as meridians in traditional Chinese medicine, nadi channels in yoga, it was believed that a latent energy could be awakened in the body and that this energy could create transformative changes in healing and consciousness. And what we're seeing, however, with our work is a more sophisticated, I believe, a more sophisticated, graceful, and organized expression of the subtle energy in the human body. It is like it's an emergent phenomenon. To me, it appears as though there is an evolutionary upgrade that is either occurring in the energy or in the system, in the human physiology and subtle energy system, that is mobilizing and promoting and utilizing the subtle energy. But there's a level of consistency, grace, refinement, sophistication, and organizational complexity that we are seeing and measuring in the human physiology when our technologies are able to unlock this inner organic technology and mobilize this energy rather. So there's a subtle energy in the body that has the ability to be mobilized in a way that it awakens higher brain potential. We know now through neuroscience that areas of the brain must awaken for meditation or contemplation to have real impact. And it appears from our work and research that there has been, again, that emergent evolutionary upgrade to that energy, a repurposing of that ancient energy, and the ability to mobilize the new expression of this energy, I believe, is a fundamental piece of a new spiritual movement. In fact, I'm convinced that our brain is evolving in such a way that it is, as it metabolizes through this energy flowing to these higher structures, it is itself recruiting more of this activation energy to energize. Regardless of the exact mechanisms, I'm convinced that an evolutionary upgrade is occurring and that this upgrade is desperately needed so that billions, instead of only a fortunate few, can access dramatic and transformative changes in their lives fueled by a latent, sacred energy destined for their higher brain, which can then be followed by new meditation and contemplation. So now that our awareness is growing through neuroscience and our understanding of integral theory informs us that high spiritual states and even high developmental structure stages of the mind have brain correlates. Now that we know that, bringing the interior and exterior, the inner and outer, together into one potent practice changes everything. There's an understanding of the human brain and its potential that simply was not known by the world's great wisdom traditions. And some of this I previously presented in my book, Source Code Meditation, Hacking Evolution Through Higher Brain Activation, but a bit more explanation about the brain's role in these higher states and stages seems apt here. So during the latter part of the 20th century, the esteemed National Institutes of Mental Health researcher, Dr. Paul MacLean, introduced pioneering data that demonstrated that the human brain was composed of interconnected yet discrete layers. MacLean identified these layers as the reptilian complex, the paleo-mammalian complex, also called the limbic system, the neo-mammalian complex called the neocortex, and they were viewed as structures sequentially added to the forebrain in the course of evolution. And once biological evolution had produced a new type of brain, which conferred a survival advantage, it was preserved and used throughout a variety of species. As evolution continued its march forward in time, new additions to the brains of species developed, one being built on top of the older, the newer built on top of the older. So a new layer built on an earlier, older, evolved brain layer. Thus, brain evolution was a process of transcending and yet including the earlier, less complex brain. So any integral theorist should be making a connection here because we know that the development of consciousness has a transcend and include, all of evolution has a transcend and include process. And the human brain actually developed through evolution in time through these layers, and these different layers of brain evolution correlate with different consciousnesses. And so the human brain thus contains the reptilian, mammalian, and human brain, which each previous layer is nested within the more recent evolutionary development. Millions of years ago, the reptilian brain, with its primary structure, the basal ganglia, proved to be a capable survival machine. Its fight, flee, feed, and fornicate automatic responses efficiently adapted it to its environment. When mammals emerged on the scene, the lizard brain was preserved but layered over in the new species. This newer mammal brain was an emotional limbic brain with its dominant structures, the amygdala and hippocampus, again layering over the old reptilian brain. And this new brain added more depth and complexity to the organism by coloring and anchoring threatening events with emotion. This created a greater repertoire of memory and with new and broader ways to sense events or environments associated with past negative experience. And as evolution continued its tireless march, early humans eventually emerged with a lizard brain, surrounded by an old mammalian brain, surrounded by a cortex. And this new brain structure, the human cortex, allowed these early humans the ability to project possible threats into the future so they could take proactive action. The neocortex eventually provided the ability to reason one's way out of harm's way. Undoubtedly, evolution used a myriad of iterations and interim structures to produce these three brain areas. However, the general model of three distinct layers of brain evolution holds true. It seems that nature does not abandon or eliminate something that works, but instead, through evolution, builds higher new structures over the older structures. All of the three layers of the human brain have their own distinct functions and strategies that relate us to the world. Regarding the three-layered brain regions, MacLean states that each area maintains their peculiar types of intelligence. These three regions are all simultaneously operating in our lives, often in competition and conflict with one another, and almost always below our conscious threshold. Much has been written about the triune brain and its distinct layers of brain evolution, and I don't want to belabor the point too much here. There's an inordinate amount of information on the topic available. I want to simply make the point at this point that the evolution of the human brain has been laid down through time in layers, and that the early layers are the most fear-based and survival-oriented. The early reptilian-like structures of the human brain is driven through fear and aggression towards the basic survival needs of food, sex, and shelter. The more recent old mammalian brain, although still dominated by survival needs, also provides basic emotions, and it desires connection and nurturing. As we continue moving outward in the physical layers of the brain, until more recently in evolutionary time, we reach the human cortex. The thing to note is that survival is still a primary focus of this brain layer, but now survival is also gained through abstract reason and intellectual prowess. A point I want to make here again is that surviving is the primary driver of all three of these distinct brain layers. However, how we survive, whether it's fight or flight based, emotional fear responses, and relational bonding and nurturing, or rational thought and cooperation, is all dependent on which of the three particular brain structures are most dominant in any particular species, or even in us humans at any point in our development. So in the 1990s, MacLean had fully developed his theory on the triune brain and expounded it in his book, The Triune Brain and Evolution. However, MacLean soon came to realize that there was a fourth evolutionary system led by evolution's latest layer, a fourth brain called the prefrontal cortex, and a whole surrounding apparatus. But to simplify, we're just going to refer to it as the PFC, the prefrontal cortex. And MacLean even referred to this part of the human brain as the angel lobes, and said these brain structures were responsible for our highest human virtues, including compassion, understanding, love, gratitude, and empathy. Based on new research, it also appears that the fourth evolutionary system is associated with higher intellectual capacities, as well as purpose, meaning, and deep spiritual experience. I believe these new brain capacities offer higher transcendent potential and are preparing us to enter an era where merely surviving gives way to purposeful thriving. So little was known about these angel lobes that Dr. MacLean spoke that many brain scientists referred to this fourth evolutionary brain layer as the silent area. The area that he spoke of was called by other brain researchers as the silent area, because this highly evolved new brain was indeed thought to be psychologically and neurologically silent, according to many scientists. I am convinced that these neuroscientists are correct, and that indeed a great deal of the capability is contained within the folds and flows of the prefrontal cortex, and its circuitry are in fact largely silent in most of us. Princeton brain surgeon Wilder Penfield referred to the PFC as the uncommitted cortex. According to Penfield, this highly evolved part of the brain is not genetically programmed at birth to serve one specific function, but is instead capable of being used in a number of different purposes. I'm going to insist that the PFC is largely raw, latent potential, ready to be energized and molded into something new and revolutionary. Human development expert Joseph Chilton Pearce has noted that this highest, most evolved part of our brain, these angel lobes, actually go through two growth spurts, one early in life and a second as we approach adulthood. Of note, we know from studies in developmental psychology that humans exhibit very little change in psychological growth beyond their early 20s. Beyond our early 20s, we usually live out the rest of our lives with the same worldviews, belief systems, values, ethics, and cognitive capacity. This is peculiar given the modern scientific fact that our brains are neuroplastic, that they're moldable and pliable, and that our higher, more recently evolved brain structures correlate with higher consciousness. It seems as though our brain can be shaped for breakthrough, and that we are on the cusp of major transformation, and yet haven't figured out how to help evolution complete this work in progress. The triune human brain has been dominated by survival motivations, and it will only be through the awakening and application of the prefrontal cortex, of this angel lobe complex, that we can shift our center of gravity from surviving into thriving. Yet this is not the end of the story. It now appears clear that the mass and matter of this prefrontal cortex itself is associated with higher states and stages of consciousness, but also the higher PFC is linked into all the other layers of the brain, and it has a suppressing and or amplifying effect on all other regions, and it can become the command center of the entire brain. What's more, when all of these brain structures are brought into service to the prefrontal cortex and coherence spreads across the brain, what I call a new physiology emerges that opens the door to a new life and a new world. And so here's the payoff. If we can change the brain before introducing potent teachings, meditation, contemplation, it changes everything. And I believe this is the crucial piece of higher spiritual awakening and higher development. So, about that new religion. In the self-development and spiritual growth marketplace of our modern and postmodern world, there are lots of ideas, philosophies, concepts centered on a variety of practices and techniques, but they seem to be generating very little sustainable transformative effect. I could quote the studies, we don't have time for that, but suffice to say, we don't seem to be moving the needle a lot in high-end, late-stage adult development. And I believe the new religion must be based on the most progressive knowledge of 21st century neuroscience, but have its roots in ancient wisdom that dates back to yogi mystics 5,000 years ago. So what I'm trying to convey is that within a new spirituality, I don't believe meditation, contemplation, and doctrine is enough. We need a fire starter. We need a shift in the physiology, a shift in the upper right quadrant. And we can do that by unlocking that latent inner organic technology inside of us, moving energy through our bodies, changing its state, and ultimately awakening higher capacities of the brain. And then contemplation and meditation become powerful. And I believe ultimately a new religion is the container for that new spirituality that's set to catalyze higher states and stages of development that frees the modern and postmodern mind from its confusion and apathy and its quiet despair, so that those of us at the leading edge can redirect, all of us, the modern, the postmodern, the metamodernists at the leading edge, can redirect all of society away from the new dark age that it seems we're heading towards, and we can create a world that works for everyone. So I'm going to go just a little deeper into my suggestions of unitary evolutionary enlightenment. That's a product that's part and parcel to what I believe is a new religion. And I want to mention again the proposed physiology, building on some of that understanding of the brain and the energy that's within us. And so as energy flows to the higher brain, the fear response dissipates. Remember, the lower brain structures are the most fear-based. Fear is the primal emotion of this stress physiology, of survival physiology. And as the shift in the upper right, as energy moves to the higher brain, metabolic changes happen in the higher brain, that command center shifts to the higher brain. Fear, the emotion of fear, starts to release. It starts to dissipate. And when this happens, the higher heart, and I don't mean this as a metaphor, I mean the heart starts to open. You can see this in the people in our community that go through our programs. The heart starts to open, and the neurological tissue that we now know is within the heart starts to wake itself up, and it appears as though there is like a wisdom in there that starts to come online. And the physiology of that higher heart synchronizes with the higher brain physiology. And you can actually see this happening. We measure the outcomes of this. And as the higher heart physiology starts to open, it starts to synchronize with the higher brain physiology. I believe we are creating the physiology for these higher states and stages of consciousness that are part and parcel to a new spirituality and a new religion, and are certainly the right hand elements, the right side, the right quadrant elements, what I'm calling unitary evolutionary enlightenment. And so as the heart opens, fear dissipates. As the higher brain comes online and the heart opens, fear dissipates and becomes synchronized. And the lower brain structures become transcended. And all of the lower structures of the brain now come into service of the higher. We actually see this on EEG evaluation as high degrees of coherence starting to spread across the entire brain as people move into these new physiological states. So there's higher energy levels that come into the higher structures of the brain and coherence that spreads across the whole brain. And this heightened, transcend, and include and synchronize dynamic in the brain creates what I believe is the emergent property in our physiology that I suggest aligns all of our cells, all of our DNA in a new way within a resonating field of emergent new holistic physiology. So the whole of our cells become radically greater than the sum of their parts. And this emergent new physiology has a resonating effect on other people that actually helps impact them, a transmission effect that positively impacts people within a community, helping to catalyze transmission or transformation rather in them. So I'm going to do this part. I'm going to just talk for a few more minutes, and I'm going to do this in somewhat of a stream of consciousness in a way that is more pointing out this unitary evolutionary enlightenment experience. And I'm going to ask that you don't try to figure it out or intellectualize it, but just to sit back, feel it in, and notice if anything resonates within you. So the evolutionary-based contemplative techniques that we use introduce into this new emergent physiology, give rise to the unitary state of consciousness. And the unitary state of consciousness within this unitary evolutionary enlightenment state and its absolute beingness couples to a radical evolutionary becoming. So here we bring the light of pure consciousness to the evolving cosmos and create heaven on earth. We realize from unitary evolutionary enlightenment that we are this consciousness right now, direct and immediate. And our consciousness is one and identical with the pure consciousness that existed before the world burst into existence some 13.8 billion years ago. We know that our consciousness is that consciousness, but we also know that we are simultaneously the evolutionary process itself, the process that started winding dead matter up at the beginning of the universe. We are now that same process waking up. Our brain and mind are expanding in such a way that we can look all the way back to our origins and see the pure primal consciousness staring back. Spirit, consciousness, God, seeing itself through you as you open a gateway into a new world. We are a mechanism that the evolutionary process is using to find its way forward. We are that, and we also have a significant part to play in the next unfolding. In Epoch 6, in this next stage of development, the transcend itself, experienced directly in this state as consciousness, being, and bliss, again, is united with the world of form in the unitary state. But the unitary enlightenment becomes taken up and fully metabolized in this new evolutionary orientation of this next stage that we call Epoch 6. The higher state of unity and the newly emerging higher life altitude merge and render the differentiation between states and stages or states and altitudes obsolete. The higher state having integrated all other states, and the highest altitude having integrated all previous altitudes, become one. And that one is felt in radical, vertical, upwards evolutionary motion, experiencing absolute perfection with every one of its new creations. As this unitary evolutionary awakening occurs, there is a conscious imperative to know oneself fully as a divinized new human. The light of consciousness pours into the world as Transcend itself and the world of form become one. Unitary enlightenment set in vertical motion, quintessentially free and unmoving while simultaneously in a state of radical, emergent becoming with the evolving cosmos. And part of the awakening is knowing that your choices from this level of awareness determine what direction evolution goes. Your life becomes bestowed with cosmic meaning. You perfect the finite through your participation in the evolutionary process. Modern cosmology and physics, as we know, trace the world's origin back 13.8 billion years. The scientific story goes something like this. First, there was nothing, and then from nothing came an explosion, a big bang, and a soup of matter and energy burst forward, along with the simultaneous creation of time and space. And over the next 13.8 billion years, this fiery, exploding, undifferentiated matter-energy soup mysteriously organized itself in such a way as to become alive. And as life continued evolving into more complex forms, the consciousness within these life forms become more complex and more awake. And now let's take a moment and contemplate this process. The process that we're now contemplating becomes embodied in unitary evolutionary enlightenment. That point that physics and cosmology saw as nothing couldn't really have been nothing, right? Something doesn't come from nothing. Zero is supposed to equal zero. Zero shouldn't in any way equate to the evolution of a universe. So what existed prior to space-time, matter, energy, and manifestation? What was there all along, eternally? It was, of course, infinite being and consciousness. Pure existence is the Transcend itself. The same Transcend itself that now looks through your eyes, hears with your ears. The same consciousness that permeates all existence, percolates with potential, and swirls with possibility. It's the same background state within you right now. The base state, the ground state. And it's that inner wellspring of creativity waiting to emerge as something new through you. Your own individuated consciousness has evolved to the point where you are awake. And once you are awake, you're responsible for your choices. And your choices from this high state of wakefulness are now new mechanisms in evolution. And in the unitary, evolutionary, enlightenment state, you know it as an experiential reality. You know that you are how spirit liberates itself from the realm of potentiality into the manifest realm of the finite world. This world where we live, breathe, and work. The world in time. The world where we have a finite amount of time to create a life well lived. And by living fully, when we leave our body, we leave it without regret. We leave a legacy of first grooves for a new stage, a new cortex, a new consciousness, a new culture. And we discover that we are what we've been waiting for. Evolution, spirit in action, becoming self-aware through us. If you understand this, your life can never be the same. And if you experience it, if you know it in identity, in the unitary evolutionary enlightenment state, your life will never be the same. And from this understanding, we must choose what's next. And we must realize that we're a shining beacon of hope for all of those that lived and loved and labored before. We're the promise to all those souls that will come after us. And we are right now in this body, on this planet, during this lifetime, essential to and responsible for the direction of this evolutionary principle. For 14 billion years, nearly 14 billion years, evolution has climbed and climbed upwards. And at this very moment, It's created a sentient being that possesses awareness with the free will to actively participate in the continued unfolding of it all. Unitary evolutionary enlightenment in its totality is the energizing, molding, and integration of new human physiology that is in a dynamic relationship to its authentic self in space and time, informed by the transcendent self that's out of space and time. And a unitary evolutionary spiritual community seeks to enlighten, evolve, and engage the life process fully. A unitary evolutionary spiritual community goes beyond the great-grandfather in the sky religions, beyond the atheism of modernity, beyond the superficiality of postmodern spiritual approaches. Unitary evolutionary spirituality provides a profound spiritual message, the required depth experiences, and a community of the adequate that lives in a radical new way. That force of eros that's felt in that state brought an entire universe into existence from nothing and continues to propel becoming and evolution moment by moment. The force of eros is experienced as sex at the reproductive level. It's experienced as creativity at the mental level, and it's experienced at purpose of the level of the soul and liberation at the spiritual level. It's the same evolutionary force. When eros moves above the waist, we feel an evolutionary intensity throughout the entire life process that's more erotically charged than any biological sexual encounter could ever offer. In practice, we don't just need a teaching and contemplation, we need to liberate the evolutionary energy within us and awaken the new evolutionary brain. And we know how to do this. The unitary evolutionary spiritual movement is a we space community that knows themselves as the transcendent self, an impersonal, absolute reality of being, consciousness, and bliss, while simultaneously each member of the unitary evolutionary spiritual community expresses their unique personal signature into the relative world of form and space-time. In all of eternity, there will only be this one unique signature, this one spark of consciousness, this particular instance of personality and behavior that is you, just so that God can know God in that specific new way through you. Unitary evolutionary spirituality celebrates evolution as spirit in action, becoming self-aware in you, as you, through you. God takes delight and fills ecstasy in a new and unique experience that wasn't possible without you. The unitary evolutionary spiritual community has an uncompromising integrity that pursues nothing less than the creation of heaven on earth. The unitary evolutionary enlightenment of a unitary evolutionary spirituality, and it's a new religion that needs to contain it. And now this is what I see the new religion catalyzing and supporting. And I want to quote briefly from the recent article in the Integral Review called Generative Enclosures, Bubbles, and Magic Circles by Bruce Alderman, Edward Burge, and Layman Pascal. And this is a quick quote. On the individual level, through practice routines, ritual behaviors, ascetic retreats, we create the conditions for the amplification of experience, the generation of zones of intensity which push us far from equilibrium and allow for the development and disclosure of new patterns or ways of being, new forms of perception, new states of consciousness, and new levels of depth and personal integration. That's spirituality, the creation of a generative enclosure on an individual level. And collectively, through social practices of establishing structure and building coherence, the different ways we have of gathering together, harnessing our energy and creativity into spheres of mutual illumination and co-inspiration through tradition, art, discourse, games, ritual, contemplative communities, and so on. The enactment of generative enclosures intersubjectively or interobjectively to foster collective well-being and wisdom is what I would call religion. But of course, they aren't entirely distinct or merely parallel movements. Religious enclosures can support individual spiritual work, and spiritual work can inspire religious flowering. I just love that, and it felt so perfect. So I want to introduce, we're about at the end, I want to introduce a quick quote from the article that we just submitted to the Integral Review. I mentioned it earlier, but the article presents nearly 130 pages of theory, philosophy, and research into late-stage adult development, including increased cognitive complexity, higher level values, and the experience of deep and transformative spiritual states. And again, all of this is being correlated with EEG brain maps. And I believe all of this is providing valuable data for the foundations of a new religion. So here's the quote out of one of the ending sections of this 130-page paper that's now at the Integral Review. Hopefully this will add further to the insights already generated in educational programs developed by Dr. Michael Cotton and his colleagues at the New Human University. Participants who completed a precursory program to the New Human University already showed improved brain coherence, communication between lobes and hemispheres of the brain, as well as higher amplitude and power trending towards the left prefrontal cortex after practicing a contemplative technique, which was the forerunner of Source Code Meditation's Summit 1 practice. Table 12, the study has a table. The table 12 shows two recordings done about 20 minutes apart, showing the change moving from right to left prefrontal cortex with increasing power in the 40 hertz in the gamma range within surface measures from 0.084 to 0.33. Here's the key. We interpret this phenomenal result as a preliminary but powerful indicator that the New Human University, Source Code Meditation, the 9 Summits of Transformation, and their sacred we space lead into the newly emerging Epoch 6. They present a meta-modern form of spirituality that moves us towards unitary evolutionary enlightenment, where our reality integrates into a seamless whole incorporating 13.8 billion years of evolution as a single process, end quote. So no doubt, today's mythic traditional religions are too regressive for rational minds and maturing souls. In the West, the New Thought Unity churches, for example, sought to cure the mythic regressive tendencies, but most of the postmodern spiritual communities have become too shallow or lack an evolutionary fire. Now, I must say it's bad enough, it's concerning enough, a better word, it's concerning enough seeing the despair in so many people who source their truth and values from modern and postmodern consciousness. But a new tragedy I see is that so many of our high-level thinkers today, the systems thinkers, the meta-modern philosophers, and just in general, so many that appear to be arriving at this integral cognitive stage of development seem to be suffering, depressed, anxious, apathy. So many integral thinkers, and often now much of the meta-modern movement, have taken this rejection of religion with them into the newly emergent metacognitive worldview. And I believe that has, in turn, left a hole in their soul. And I believe what is needed to fill this vacuum of meaning is a new religion based on a new spirituality. A new religion is needed to promote unitary evolutionary enlightenment. Here's the thing. Suicide rates have doubled in the last 2 decades. Addiction rates have doubled in the last 2 decades. Depression is increasing at a dramatic and alarming rate. Meaningless in life is increasing. The recent happiness index shows America population at its lowest levels of reported happiness since World War II. And much of this is happening within the atheists, those who report themselves as atheists, and within the spiritual but not religious movements. So this no religion idea just isn't working. We need a new religion for the cultural creatives, for the meta-modernists who have outgrown mythic literal religion, who found atheism desperately lacking, who've grown sick of the flat land of the New Age movements, the non-denominational churches, and the spiritual but not religious communities. We need a new religion to support and further catalyze the yearning for that which represents ultimate concern. And at this new religion, at the leading edge, the new religion needs to communicate with the entire spiral of development. It has to reach down and embrace everyone wherever they are and communicate in their language, offer teachings and practices that can be engaged by everyone while simultaneously providing deliberate developmental teachings and techniques for everyone. We must transcend the old ways, and we must include the best of those old ways too. We don't want to abandon rational consciousness, but on the other side of it, we must learn to source our truth from something deeper. That something dwells within us. We have so much conditioning stripping away the wonder that it has become easy to live a life of quiet desperation. But really, this world is nothing but pure enchantment. We just forgot. Our origin story begins with the universe exploding into being from nothing 13.8 billion years ago. Dancing quanta were there then and are still now, continuously coming from nowhere and arriving inexplicably in space and time. An unseen arrows is directing it all towards greater degrees of biological complexity and toward greater degrees of the mystery of all mysteries, consciousness. And just to think, if we're truly honest, we have no idea why there is something, anything at all, rather than nothing. It's all just radically unknowable and enchanting, and reminds me of an Augustine quote, "If you comprehend it, it is not God." And so it is in this relative realm of space and time. We are right here, right now, and we are evolution becoming self-aware. The entire mystery encoded in our DNA, the entire 13.8 billion years of the cosmic becoming nested in our bodies, and the ever-present consciousness that thrust it all forward has donated to us the same being that we know absolutely as our personal existence. Thank you for your time, and thanks so much to the organizers for this awesome opportunity. I'm Dr. Michael Cotton. It was great sharing an hour with you.